Alex raises an important point that I think helps illuminate the discussion, which is the fact is that in Grameen Bank, they were able to depend on savings. And certainly if one has an opportunity in a regulatory regime to mobilize savings, the need for, external capital, certainly goes down. The fact is, however, that Bangladesh is a very unique situation. By a special act of Parliament, Professor Yunus was able to get Grameen Bank a banking license to take savings. That is just not the reality in India. In most of the developing countries where you've got very conservative central bankers, the length of time it would take to actually mobilize or wait for a banking license or the ability to take savings would be a constraint. And we simply don't think that it's fair to keep a poor woman or many poor women waiting until that regulatory regime changes. So while it would be great to have a savings-led regime, the fact is we have to start with the reality we have. India has the most poor people in the world, unfortunately, and going to the capital markets is the place that we're going to be able to get that, capital. The other thing I'll mention is that I don't think there's a dichotomy between, or rather a tension between profits and impact. As I mentioned, over the last 3 years, we've reduced our interest rates 3 times, yet simultaneously our return on investment has gone up. And the reason why I think this is important is I think good business is not about extracting from the poor. Certainly that's a good social business, but even a good for-profit business is more about doing what's right for the customer. So for example, in FKS, we don't incentivize on loan side. Now if you do so, you'll actually get more profit from your customers. But we don't do that because the idea is to do what's right for your customer, even if she needs only a $40 loan. And then eventually, if you treat her right, she'll stay with you as she moves up the economic ladder, and that's when you create shareholder value. So it's really a question of if you run business looking at long-term shareholder value, you actually end up doing what's best for the customer and that creates the greatest social impact. And I think that's the right way to run business, whether it's a business that works with the poor or a general business as well. But clearly in a business that works with the poor, that's the way we've been able to create the greatest shareholder value, and that's the way we've been able to simultaneously reduce our profits. One can say theoretically that there's an opposition, but the fact is we've been able to do that and demonstrate that you can actually have both.
Fantastic, thank you. Alex?
If I have a few seconds...
You do.
I'll give him a minute.
He has 30 seconds.
Thank you. Just one thing on the political backlash. There is no doubt a political backlash in India going on right now. But I would say that the backlash now and previously is less about uncomfortability with profits as more about politicians slowly losing their hold over the poor. Anytime you disturb vested interests who typically had a hold, there's oftentimes a very close nexus between local money lenders, loan sharks, and politicians. There will be a backlash. Professor Yunus has gone through this in Grameen Bank many times over, and he's overcome it, and that gives us inspiration that we will here. And I think that's the key thing that's going on. You're disrupting, a social system that has put down the poor, and it's less about, whether it's right to make profits or not.
Thank you. Alex?
I would agree with Vikram that there is, and we've seen this in many countries, the opportunistic politicians who are using the microfinance and how it's liberating people and creating new relationships and using that as an excuse. I think there are also politicians, Vikram says he's decreased his interest rates. He's decreased from rates, and even to rates, that are very controversial in any context, even the United States, certainly India. In some countries, charging any interest to the poor is controversial. He's not named the rates, and that's we get into that shorthand in microfinance because it's a bit charged to actually name the rates that we charge, which in the case of Grameen, one of the lowest in the world is 20%, and that's controversial. So I think that there are politicians with actually good motivations putting pressure on microfinance, some by the wrong means. But I think that what SKS could have done, and what some MFIs, including Grameen, could have done, is to inoculate themselves against that inevitable backlash that comes from actually doing right by the poor by adopting clear metrics, around what they're doing to move people out of, that they're actually working with the poor, and the poor are coming out of poverty. These are the metrics like the Progress Out of Poverty Index, and there are others. That's not the only one, it's just the most widely used one. Could also inoculate themselves by putting limitations on profitability, as some MFIs are doing, and limitations on the private benefit of senior staff, of investors, of even middle staff, and particularly how that benefit compares to the benefit of clients in an event like an IPO. By not inoculating themselves against that, leave themselves open for these opportunistic politicians and regulators to have a field day, and that's just what we're afraid of. The other thing is that I worry about, I don't begrudge Vikram his millions that he's earned out of the IPO. I have enough money to do the things that I want to do in my life, and he does too, and so we're both in a position that the world's poor are not. However, when I look at the example of SKS, which is going to be followed, like the example of Grameen, I think about organizations, because in many African countries, for example, in the Philippines, you actually can mobilize savings. There is the regulatory support to that, and I think that's only going to grow. But the question is, when you have an MFI manager saying, am I going to go through the process of qualifying to take deposits, using that as my engine, or go the private equity route to an IPO, to becoming a millionaire and doing good by the poor, hopefully, that many organizations may not go through that painstaking process of local mobilization of deposits or investment from social investors who have a double bottom line objective and will go for this quicker route, which promises ideally, theoretically, benefit to the poor, but also significant private benefit to themselves and their staff. And I'm worried about that, because I think the longer route, the route to the savings and mobilizing local capital, is probably the safest and the surest route to benefit the poor long term.
Thank you. Now, we are going to take questions